So I'm Brad Littlejohn. I'm here with my friend Alastair Roberts, and we wanted to talk a bit today about Jordan Peterson, who everyone seems to be talking about nowadays. I hate fads, so if I see something that everyone's talking about, I kind of just ignore it for a while and see if it's still a thing, a few months, a year later. So finally, after everyone had still been talking about Jordan Peterson for at least a year, I decided to go ahead and pick up the 12 Rules for Life, and I'm about two-thirds way through it, and I'm actually listening to the audiobook, which I think is a very different experience when I've heard people reading it versus listening to the audiobook. And he has a very compelling voice and really brings to life in a very human way the ideas that he's articulating, which can otherwise seem a bit, I think, impersonal and dispassionate. But I mean, I've found it really remarkable and illuminating and thought-provoking, in some ways helpful in my own life, and of course other ways in which, as a Christian, I think it illuminates. I mean, what I love about his work is, I think it brings a clarity to actually the essential difference of Christianity that can otherwise be missing. I mean, I feel like we talk about this idea of natural law, and I think our society is in such kind of willful rebellion against so many aspects of reality that have been taken for granted by previous generations, Christian or non-Christian, that we can get a sort of warped sense of like what is actually the difference between Christianity and unbelief, and we draw the battle line in all these places where it might seem to be in our moment, but it isn't necessarily, in the sense that you can be a virtuous pagan and get a lot of things right that we often, as Christians, sort of falsely claim as, well, only if you're a Christian can you do such and such and such and such. And that's not necessarily true. You read someone like Aristotle or Cicero or Marcus Aurelius, and you get this remarkable grasp of the order of the world. That there's an order, there's a teleology, there's a purpose, there's a moral order, and there's an idea of human nature, and there's something that we are there's something that we are supposed to be, and if we do not live in accord with that nature, it's going to be disastrous for us. And this idea that we're not, they don't maybe have a sense of the fall, but they have a sense it's not like that our instincts are good and healthy almost. Yeah. We have to learn to discipline
our friend
desires.
Eric Hutchinson wrote a really good piece in Calvinist International on just the significance of suffering as a factor in philosophy, and the way that Peterson foregrounds this. I think that's one of the reasons why people really are moved and challenged by him, because suffering is something we have to take seriously.
Yeah, and I think that the modern world really tries to sort of sideline it and avoid it and run from it, and you're not going to have a very deep or well-formed ethic without that. So I think what you get in this book is, in many ways, it struck me as a kind of a new pagan virtue of the sort that you might encounter in someone like Aristotle or Cicero, but precisely by doing that, actually throws into sharper relief where the actual central difference between Christianity and unbelief lies.
Though it is a bit more complicated in Peterson's case,
because he is deeply shaped by the Bible in a way that, so we don't have a straightforward natural law here. He actually, in the sense of something that can be known from nature alone, he is reading the scriptural narrative, informed by it, thinks that it has a perhaps uniquely insightful grasp of the shape of reality, and yet, by not accepting it as true in an objective sense, and not accepting certainly Christ as true, there is a.
I mean, he would dispute that he doesn't take him as true, but what true means for him is not the same as what we would use that term.
Right. So ultimately, you end up with a kind of self-salvation here, and that would be the critique: is that this is, in as much as it's Christian, it's a Pelagian Christianity.
That critique is interesting. He does engage with that critique in certain places. And what he points out is he pushes back against some of the accusations of Pelagianism, while emphasizing that one of the things that Christians have often underemphasized is the need to take up our crosses and follow Christ.
Right. Yeah.
That Christ is not just someone who saves us so that we don't have to do anything, but he's the one who is, we are conformed to him by the Spirit and other things like that, that we are saved as we are made like him. And that is an element that I think there is an element of genuine critique of much Christianity there that I think should be taken seriously, although there is that element that is Pelagian. There's not a strong account of grace within Jordan Peterson's work. That's one of the weaknesses. There is an element of grace, and there's certainly a sense of mercy in the way that he judges people, that he talks about the brokenness of humanity. He has a sort of doctrine of sin, and he has a doctrine of fallen nature. And
it's definitely compassion. It's not a hard legalism.
Yes. But at the same time, there isn't a deep sense of how we are formed by grace. I've thought, for instance, he wants to push back against rights language and the way that we think of ourselves in terms of entitlement and other things like that. And he's moving towards responsibility. But there's a way we can step beyond that still. And we can think of living in terms of grace and gratitude, which is a Christian approach that does not leave responsibility behind. I mean, there is a duty to respond in gratitude to the grace that we have received. And that duty is also something that, through God's grace, we are enabled to respond. And I think that step is not one that he fully takes, and I'd like to see him exploring that more. Because on his own terms, I think Christianity has a stronger account of these things than he does.
Yeah, I mean, what's missing here is the idea of you are not your own, you were bought with a price. There's a big stress on taking ownership of yourself, which is, I think, a really important corrective to the world in which we live, in which there's a real discourse of victimhood is ubiquitous on both the left and the right. I mean, the right sees it on the left, but then they just immediately adopt the same discourse, and we're all we see ourselves as the passive victims of these. If it's on the left, it's oppressive patriarchy and gender dynamics and so on and so forth. If you're on the right, it's the government, the state out there is
this, feminism
or feminism, or right. It's these movements that are we talk so much about the bad guys out there, the threats, the enemies, the things that are the powers, principalities and powers, whatever, that we don't actually ask ourselves what are the decisions that we are making and what aspects of our situation are we responsible for. And I think this is a great challenge in this book, and this is all I've read of him. So I know there's many elements to stuff, but what struck me in this book is just that call to take up the burden of being a moral agent.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a key preparation for the gospel, in the sense that if it's actually only by taking up the call of being a moral agent that you can then recognize your failings and inabilities as a moral agent and your need for grace. I think many people don't even get to that point because they don't even accept agency to begin with.
And on the other hand, it is divine forgiveness that enables us to take up our agency.
Right.
The fact that we are forgiven people enables us to talk truthfully about our sin without being destroyed by that knowledge, and without having that sense that if we can't self-justify, we will be losing some status in the pecking order or something like that. When we admit our sin, will we just become the slaves of the people that we confess our sin to? They being able to master us through our guilt. And the gospel enables us to be more truthful about our sin, to take up a sort of moral agency that is very difficult to assume without it. I think one of the things I've found helpful about Peterson is his approach is one that foregrounds the importance of integrity. For instance, the way he talks about lying.
Yeah.
The way he talks about setting your own house in order first. These sorts of things are presented with a power and a force in his work that is almost unrivaled within Christian thought. I've not seen I've not read much Christian work that has presented lying as seriously as he does. Lying for him is something that leads to corruption of our integrity and leads us towards hell, as he calls it, and also towards the social totalitarianism and these sorts of things that he sees as very real threats. It's worth bearing in mind that his vision of human agency and virtue is shaped very much by the totalitarianisms of the 20th century, the disasters of communism and fascism, that he's not thinking about, as a psychiatrist, how to make people adaptive and conforming to just general social reality. He's thinking about how to form people that have the integrity to withstand a Hitler or Stalin. Right. People who will be able to dig within themselves the deep wells of a healthy society. Because he sees in the individual the wells of social integrity, that if those wells are closed up in us, our societies will become corrupt. And so the corruption of individual persons and the corruptions of societies at large can't be separated from each other. So, for instance, the fact that about a quarter of German society were involved with the Stasi, all the little petty grievances, resentments, antagonisms, grudges, and squabbles that existed within the society, the little things that they didn't deal with, ended up growing into this great monster that held everyone oppressed, in a state of oppression. And likewise with a society where people do not speak the truth. Mm-hmm. He came to public awareness, wider public awareness, very much in his opposition to Bill C-16, about transgender pronouns and things like that, compelled speech, being expected to say something by law that you don't actually believe is true. And that, people think, oh, it's such a small thing. I mean, can't you just say he instead of she for this particular person? I mean, why would you die on that hill? But for him, it is seen very much in light of this, the need to maintain integrity. And when integrity is sacrificed, even the small things, and when we start to say things that are not the truth and that we know are not the truth, that way lies totalitarianism.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the powerful things in this book I've seen is his recognition of the capacity for good and evil that is in each of us. Basically, we were tempted to think there are certain kinds of people who are moral monsters, and I would never be one of those people. And recognition of the build-up, the way in which resentment and bad habits and abdication and self-deception and so on can lead an otherwise good person down an inexorable path further and further into darkness. And conversely, how someone in a very deep hole can start making right decisions and step by step grow into a virtuous person. I mean, I think that's the
and he's not someone who's glorifying our powers of action.
Right.
I mean, he talks very often about people in positions of extreme suffering, where the bounds of their agency might only be the next 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But as they recognize those bounds and develop out those bounds, they can take charge of their lives in a way that they could not otherwise. They can become moral agents, not just defined by the limits. And very often we allow ourselves to be defined by the limits to our agency,
right,
which tend to close in on us as a result. We speak about our powerlessness, and we discover more and more powerlessness as a result. But yet, if we are people who take whatever little moral agency we have and seek to grow it out and to work with that and to be those who build up the walls of the city of the self, ensure that they are not broken down, we can achieve things that we would not otherwise. Now, there are definitely biblical themes there, the sort of themes that you encounter in the book of Proverbs and elsewhere, that I think many of us have found in our own experience that these things have been liberating and empowering in ways that messages about powerlessness and victimhood and rights, all these sorts of things, these have not empowered us in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of Christian discourse now is in America, perhaps particularly. I can't speak for the context. Has this antinomianism that is very much the let go and let God sort of thing, and embrace your powerlessness and throw yourself on Christ, which is true. But if that's all we say, then we are actually accepting this kind of forfeiture of our moral agency and accepting and we are forgetting the call, as you say, to take up our cross and follow Christ. And so I think, yes, this is a Pelagian extreme, perhaps, but as a valuable corrective to the kind of antinomianism in a lot of American Christianity, this is something that Christians, I think, can and must learn from.
Yes.
Now, another thing that struck me about it is simply his attentiveness. This is something that we talk a lot about at Davenant Institute, is to the category of nature. Yes. And the idea that there is and ironically, I mean, we as Christians, we're accustomed to hearing, well, of course, evolutionists can't take seriously the idea of nature or objective order or anything. It's all just fluid, and yet he very explicitly approaches things from a standpoint of evolutionary psychology, and yet takes very seriously the idea that there is a given shape to human nature as we experience it, and therefore his morality is guided by that. And what I was struck by is particularly chapter 5 on parenting, where he is actually going on quite a limb for a secular psychologist in defending corporal punishment. And most Christian so much Christian discourse about parenting it's sort of fideistic. It's sort of like, well, God requires us to do this for our children. God requires us to spank our children. God requires us to do this, whatever. And we just do it sort of in blind trust that if we do these things that God requires, then He will sort of bless it. It's not even a cause and effect relationship in the sense that our action helps cause and effect. It's sort of like we do this, sort of a test of faith. God says do this, and then God sort of miraculously produces this fruit. But that's not how parenting works. There is a cause and effect relationship between the sorts of things that you do to your children, do for your children, and the ways in which that helps them grow and mature. And he takes seriously what human nature is actually like in talking about how you're supposed to raise your children in a way that I hear very few Christian parenting books doing.
And more generally, the way that he's responding to, he sees a twofold crisis of nihilism and totalitarianism, of chaos and extreme order that we face within the contemporary world, particularly as the collapse of traditional norms, Christian values, things like that, as a result of the so-called death of God. His response to that is to draw people's attention to the fact that we have a nature that, and he challenges Nietzsche, for instance, saying that we can't just impose our own meaning upon ourselves because we have a nature. And so when he's using people like Young, and when he's talking about Darwinian concepts, it's in defense of that nature, that for him, Darwin means that we are bound up with the natural order, that we have been shaped by that, and we are shaping it, and we have a particular form. We have a collective unconscious as well, these sort of deep instincts and these images, these connections that can't just be willed into existence in any way we want. Our world is shaped by stories, by images, by instincts that are innate to human nature. And as a result, so for instance, categories like male and female are not just social constructions. These are deep parts of our being. Mm-hmm. As any society you go to, you'll encounter these things. These are universals for human nature.
And that's another area where so much Christian discourse kind of adopts this fideism. They're like, well, God says men are supposed to do this and women are supposed to do this, and so, it may not make sense. It may seem like you guys are equal and interchangeable, but, you need to fulfill these roles that God has assigned to you, instead of like actually attending to the natural differences. In someone like Peterson is way more attentive to that, I think, than most Christian discourse.
Yes, and if you read the social psychologists and the evolutionary psychologists and people like that he's referring to, they are attending to these natural differences, to natural patterns and things like that, in ways that Christians have often neglected. We've often not thought about the ways in which these things are part of the natural structure of our reality. They're not just things imposed by divine fiat and law from outside that we must adhere to. These things are the grain of our humanity, and we need to learn to work with that grain. And so when the concepts of Christianity and other things come up, he will talk about the Bible as something thrown up by the collective unconscious. And if you want to understand who you are, you go to this text. It's a remarkable way of approaching the Bible for a non-Christian, that if you want to learn who you are, read the Bible, because it will tell you who you are. Now, so much contemporary thought denies human nature at its very outset, seeing things as what we'd call human nature as merely a construction of power structures, things like the patriarchy, things like that, or it's maybe something that is purely performative, that we form there's no such thing as set biological differences. These are just social constructions that we would take these particular organs or these particular functions as having a specific significance that should define our relationships. But he's saying that there is a grain of human nature, there's a reality here that we can't ignore. And so when we're reading through these deep works of history and of religion and cultures, we are encountering our nature. That the humanities, for instance, are studying humanity, our nature itself, not merely texts that we can deconstruct and recognize the power structures and systems and use them almost as a corpse upon which to practice techniques. But this is how we discover who we are, by learning how we function. For instance, what happens in a Soviet society, or what happens in a great epic poem from a Greek context.
Yeah, one thing that's striking to me about it is Christians are so, in many circles, become so habituated to talking about secular science as this enemy, and when you read something like this, you realize how much of the modern thought, modern culture that we're opposing is actually wildly unscientific. Yeah. And actual scientists who are attentive to the world are often, because they're attentive to the world, they're seeing things and arguing things that are that we actually agree with and that are useful for Christians to be taking on board. And we're in a sort of false crusade against science, when actually our crusade is against this what is really a rebellion against real knowledge of the natural order that we see in a lot of the social sciences nowadays and political discourse.
And there is increasingly the reality that evolutionary psychologists and biologists and other people like that are seen as deeply politically incorrect. They're looking at things that we should not be looking at, things that we're expected not to notice. And they're bringing these to public awareness, and people are recoiling from them.
Yeah.
But Peterson, I think, is prepared to push those issues into the public square. It's one of the reasons why I think the reaction against him is so intense, that people don't just disagree with him, they want to exorcise him, as it were, from the public square, because he represents this threatening knowledge, a threatening knowledge of deep differences that exist, of a deep rootedness that exists within nature, that we are not just creatures of human social construction. We can't just recreate human society in our image. And the challenges that we're facing, for instance, in a gender-neutralizing society, are ones that arise out of our nature itself, our nature rebelling and pushing against that and struggling with it. And those challenges are not ones that we want to take seriously.
Now, talk to me for a bit about why you see and we've already touched on it some, but why has Peterson struck such a chord in the church?
The first time I ever saw anything by Peterson was back in 2011, I think it was, 2011 or 13. But I saw a video of him on a TEDx talk at the University of Toronto, and he was talking about redefining reality. And his vision of redefining reality was a sort of phenomenology mixed with existentialism, and then with sort of dash of Jungianism and Darwinianism, which is pretty much what he has now. But what I saw in that was really the core of his message, which is opposed to the highly objectified vision of reality presented by science, where we just have human beings almost extracted from the world, and all the things that we take seriously, our consciousness, our meaning, our values, don't actually find a home in the world. We're estranged from reality. Reality is just stuff in motion and matter, dead matter. He's trying to redefine reality, to recognize that it's more than that. So the phenomenologists to break down some of the subject-object polarization, that we are bound up with reality. So for instance, attending to the body again. The body is world, but it's also me. It's that interface, that joining, the marriage of world and self, and that sort of attentiveness to the body is important. But then also that reweighting of reality, that reality has a glory that shines forth. And he argues that meaning is not just something that you perceive the objective world and then you attach meaning to it as a sort of subjective imposition from outside. Rather, we perceive meaning directly. So when I see that book, I perceive it as a be picked up, to be read thing. It's a meaning-laden object.
It's breaking down the fact-value distinction.
Exactly. And so he also argues that reality shines forth, and that is something inherent to reality. It's not just something that we are a collective hallucination about reality almost. And so when I'm engaging with reality, when I see beauty in the world, I'm responding to something that's really there, not just to something that I've perceived to be there. And that leads, I think, to what he's trying to do is push beyond a nihilistic view of reality and push beyond a purely materialistic view of reality. And that post-nihilistic, post-materialistic view of reality is one in which human life has weight and significance and meaning. And what you do matters. Suffering really matters. And it forms you in ways that shape your intention, shape your existence within the world. And there are moments, he argues, where we are able to see the world slightly differently. So for instance, when two people fall in love, it's as if they can see the glory in each other. That's something that we're usually blinded to or dulled to. And children have a sense of that too, their playfulness, their openness to the world and to wonder and to awe and to surprise and excitement. Their attentiveness has not been narrowed down in the ways that our attention has been whittled down to a very inglorious engagement with reality on a purely functional level, for instance. And so that understanding of reality is one of the reasons why I think he does resonate so much. He touches a nerve because people want to believe reality has weight. We know it has weight. And when someone speaks in a way that has conviction and just this deep sense of the weight of reality and the meaningfulness of our work within it, what it means that there is a difference between good and evil, not just right and wrong, but good and evil, that there is such a thing as a sort of hell that you can work towards. If you are someone who allows yourself to become corrupted and to sacrifice your integrity, that's the direction you're heading. That there are life and death stakes, and that what you do really matters. That grabs people.
I mean, and that seems reminiscent in many ways. I'm sure I'm not the zillionth person to make this comparison, but with Lewis's Abolition of Man, and the sort of polemic in there. Again, I mean, he starts out with basically this fact-value distinction, this idea that when we, and how destructive that is. The idea that there's just brute facts in the world, and then any kind of meaning, any kind of appreciation of beauty, any kind of moral meaning that we attach to it is simply something that we have attached to it, that we've subjectively added on. Instead of it being the opposite, as you're saying, that it's objectively there, and it's more like we sometimes subjectively close ourselves off from it. And yeah, so seems to be a lot of resonance between chapter 1, especially the abolition of men, but also chapter 2, where he's arguing for the idea of a kind of a way, a universal moral order that we are attuned to. Can you reflect on that?
Yes. So within Peterson, he argues for the significance. For instance, pain is not primarily just a thing to be objectively measured. Pain is a deep psychological fact. Likewise, if you're dealing with human psychology, you can't just deal with it according to a purely illness model. You must recognize that human experience is structured by narrative, by things such as what he calls the opposition between order and chaos, and how we navigate that distinction, how we exist on the boundary between order and chaos, recognizing the significance of order but the danger of falling into totalitarianism, and then the significance of chaos as that which brings forth new things, which has possibilities and these sorts of things, without falling into nihilism. And so his reweighting of psychological experience, I think, he expresses in terms of things like the Tao, and also yin-yang and these sorts of concepts, and also, very more than anything else, the concepts that we find within the Old Testament and the New Testament, in terms of the creation narrative, in terms of Christ. And he pays a lot of attention within the book to just the story of the fall, the story of Genesis, the garden. These are the stories that shape his understanding of human nature in large measure, because they give us the fundamental coordinates of our existence. Now, there are ways that you can question the way he plays things out, but there is, for instance, the notion of order and chaos within Genesis, or structures of forming and filling, the deep archetypal notions of male and female. These structure the narrative. And the modern reader of the Bible, for the most part, Christian or otherwise, tends to miss all of this. They tend to read it just as in a sort of quasi-scientific mode, that these are just a sequence of events that happened, or if they don't believe it didn't happen. Whereas it's more than that. These are the structures of reality that are bound up with human perception and our sense of our place within the world. There's a choreography of reality that we are part of. And so male and female are related to these fundamental patterns of reality itself. So the woman is related to the earth, right. And then the man is related particularly to processes of forming. And these things are played out in our subconscious, they're played out within our social structures, they're played out within all these different areas of our lives. But yet, in the modern world, we tend to resist that way of looking at reality. And he's bringing that to the foreground again in a way that I think is illuminating in part of how a more traditional society thinks, but also how, as natural human beings, we process reality not just as objective, out there reality, but as something that we are subjectively bound up in.
Now, you wrote a couple months back a piece about what pastors in particular should learn from Jordan Peterson. Can you reflect a little bit on that?
Yes, I think there are a number of things that really strike me. One of the things that Peterson is remarkable for is the attention that he pays to people. He's not primarily arguing about an ideology. There are ideological elements, perhaps, within what he's arguing, but he is deeply concerned about people and attentive to people. Much of his work comes from being a clinical psychologist, right, and paying attention, whereas so much of our more general cultural reflection on things like male and female is about abstract abstract theoretical concepts. Rather than, you don't recognize your neighbor or your wife or your kid in these things. These are just abstract concepts, whereas he's dealing with more concrete realities. And he's, in that attention to people, he learns more about the world, about reality. Now, I think pastors, if they're to be good pastors, they should primarily be paying attention to reality itself.
Right.
And they should be paying attention to the persons that they are, whose spiritual well-being is committed to their care.
And part of the problem is the pastor today is expected to do so many different things.
Yeah.
He's a pastor. He's also a preacher, and often it's easy to focus on the task of preaching and just be an exegete of the biblical word, and maybe be a great preacher, but who is utterly ill-equipped to actually apply that to the lives of the people under his care and to actually understand how the biblical text speaks to them. But also, the pastor nowadays is expected to be an administrator, a business-minded guy, who knows how to, who knows about marketing, who knows how to get the message out, and we've, I think, sort of steadily pulled away from the kind of core virtues of the pastor, as a shepherd of souls,
yes,
as a physician of souls, and in many ways turn that over to clinical psychologists, and pastors might rail against psychology, but people are going to go where they're actually getting helped, and if they're not, if their pastor is not sufficiently aware of what the human soul is like to actually be able to treat their ailments, they're going to seek treatment elsewhere.
I think also within something like Peterson, you see authority at work.
Yeah.
Authority that is not just he has a particular office and people have to listen to him whether they like it or not. People want to be led towards the good. They want to be led towards maturity, and people gravitate towards Peterson because he represents something they aspire to. And when they see that, they also see that he cares about them. That it's not just about throwing ideas and accusations in their face or shaming them. He actually cares about their flourishing, and you see him crying even about the way that young men in our society are struggling. That resonates with people, because when you see someone who loves you and cares about you and wants to direct you towards the good, that's generally how good authority works. So for instance, if we're reading Ephesians 5, it talks about wives submit to your husbands. It does not say husbands exercise authority over your wives. It says husbands love your wives and build them up, and there's that sense that the love of the husband is what the submission response is supposed to respond to. And then when we're thinking about people who are good pastors, they are people that the congregation can know the love of their pastor for them. Their deep concern for them. And I think Peterson represents that. I think the other thing that Peterson does is he speaks with a passion and a conviction and a firm belief that these things matter. And so often that's absent from pulpits. Pulpits can be histrionic. The things that take place in the pulpit can be histrionic and very emotionally demonstrative, but it's an act often. You know that there's nothing really backing it up. Whereas when you see someone who's truly convinced and who is held by the truths that they're presenting, that these truths have captured their soul and they just have to unburden themselves of this message, like the prophet with the word of God burning within them, you respond to that in a different way. And the pathos and the ethos that he brings to his speech, I think, is something that people naturally respond to. Another thing that pastors can learn is that...
And that's a principle for Christian teachers more generally.
Yes, and for all of us. I mean, if you're a parent, this is something that is involved too. The other thing, I think, that people still respond to preaching, because when you listen to a Peterson lecture, it's probably more like a sermon than a general academic lecture much of the time. And people are turning up in their multitudes to hear his lectures because he preaches things that are true and things that have weight and things that matter. He talks about suffering. He talks about evil. He talks about sin and death. He talks about human nature, and he talks about male and female, all these things that have weight in our world. And yet pastors can so often just get lost in abstract ideas and fail to speak with weight about things that have weight in a world where there are life and death stakes.
And many pastors, I think, are encouraged to not be too confrontational by just speaking in terms of personal experience. So many sermons now are simply narratives of my spiritual journey, which always, almost inevitably, being first world narratives are full of first world problems.
Yep.
And you have this, my wife and I have talked hearing these sermons, like, yes, narrative is powerful. Yes, we need to hear some narratives, but we are so insulated from suffering that most of the narratives that we have to tell look sort of comically incongruous than with the biblical struggles that they're supposed to be illustrating.
And that belief in human nature, I think, is important here, because if you truly believe in human nature, you believe that human experience and its basic coordinates are common to every human being. And you can speak with authority into other people's experience because you know something of human nature. Whereas if you don't have a firm belief and conviction about human nature, you'll say, oh, this is what I found to be true for myself. Try to emphasize, you might find it too.
Yep. So finally, let's talk a little bit about what are some things we need to be on guard against as Christians. And we started off talking a bit about the danger of the sort of Pelagianism, and the danger also of a reading of Scripture that we're all too familiar with in the modern world that can maybe detach sort of mythic meaning from an actual historical meaning. This didn't actually need to happen. It just needs to illustrate something about the human condition. So I think those are obvious dangers to be on guard against. What are some others you think?
I think first of all we need to think carefully about our forms of engagement with someone like Peterson. There's often a tendency, particularly in worldview types of Christianity, to either baptize someone wholesale or to resist them on account of some fundamental principle that corrupts every aspect of their thought. Whereas, as Christians, I think, we find ourselves in a world where there is much to learn from people outside the walls of the church, where there are certain truths that are exposed and revealed to people who are not Christians and that we need to be attentive to. Christians have long been learning from the pagans in their philosophy and their ethics and things like this. We do not believe, we have not generally believed that we have a corner on the truth that is such that there is nothing to be learned from people outside. And so we do have to have the gates, as it were, of the church open to ideas coming from without, the riches of the nations being brought to the church. But that needs to be a watchful engagement.
And so that we should be encouraged to a kind of eclecticism, where the word eclecticism can have this sort of bad connotation, as you're just being sort of haphazard. But the Davenant conference we were just doing on natural law, this was sort of one of the themes, is recognizing how in the historic Christian tradition, appropriation of pagan thought was not, I mean, yes, there were Christian Platonists and there were Christian Aristotelians, and there was sometimes this tendency to sort of baptize a system wholesale. But at our best moments, there was a recognition that, no, we should be eclectic because we should expect pieces of the truth to be found in different places, but not the whole truth anywhere. And so let's take the truth where it can be found and integrate it with the gospel.
Yes, I think that's the first thing that I think we need to think when we're engaging with someone like Jordan Peterson. He's also created a bridge between deep cultural anxieties and concerns and the Christian message. Now, the concern I have is that traffic moves in the right way on that bridge. Because it's very easy for people who are Christians who feel that their pastors have not spoken to these deep concerns of theirs, to see in Jordan Peterson something that is attractive, and it is genuinely attractive because he's speaking to realities that, for instance, many men within the church feel a resonance with Peterson's message and yet have felt alienated by much teaching from the pulpit. The concern I have is that in that sort of situation, we do not allow we do not just hold out some of Peterson's insights in a way that prevent us from addressing these things in a fuller way within a Christian understanding. More
just because you're hungry to hear something doesn't mean that something is the gospel.
Exactly. Then there's also the fact that the historicity of the message. For instance, that the resurrection happened is not just a secondary fact. It holds everything together. And in some ways, he's not settled on this particular question. But it comes to the very heart of his system. The question is the world itself, and the world as processed psychologically that we experience, what is the connection between those two things? And in events such as the resurrection, that question is thrown into sharp relief. Is this just something that we're, the logic of human nature, but it's detached from the actual world order out there?
Right.
That this is something that helps us to function well within reality, but fundamentally it's a myth with no historical veracity. That is a huge question that I don't think that he answers satisfactorily. And as long as it is left unanswered, I think there are some key threads at the heart of his system that need to be tied up. And I think he recognises that he needs to take this question seriously, and he does take it seriously. But as Christians, taking the historicity of the resurrection and other events in Scripture seriously gives us a way to give weight to the mythic elements, as it were. C.S. Lewis has talked about true myth, and he makes this one particular remark within it that's very telling. I think applies very well to how we think about someone like Peterson. He says something to the effect that perhaps if someone who did not believe in the Christian message as fact, but constantly fed upon it as myth, perhaps they would be more spiritually alive than someone who believed in it as fact, but gave it no further thought. And that's often how it is within the church. People say, okay, this creation narrative is happened, etc., or the resurrection happened, all these sorts of things. But they don't actually draw upon the deep psychological importance and sociological importance of these facts, that these should become the fundamental coordinates for our existence, our self-understanding, our way of comporting ourselves within the world. And pastors at their best communicate that, enable people to see what that means in practice. But so often they fall far short. And so I think Peterson, in one way, he is drawing us towards a deeper apprehension of the mythic character of Scripture and how important that is. But on the other hand, in not dealing strongly with the facticity, the veracity, historical veracity, and these other aspects, that is placed on a shaky foundation. And at a certain point, it's like he's built this grand building. You see this remarkable building, but the foundations have not yet been unveiled. You think, well, it's a wonderful looking building, but if he removes if he unveils the foundations and they seem to be shaky, then what's the point? It will collapse. But as Christians, I think we can recognize the strength of much of what he's doing in the project and provide stronger foundations. So there's that. The grace element, I think, is another key aspect. That the Christian message, grace is not just something that we can add to things about responsibility and virtue and these sorts of dimensions we've been talking about. Grace is architectonically central in every single respect. And that, again, I think Peterson would be stronger, his position would be stronger for taking that seriously. It's not something that would, he must admit as some extra part, but it would enable him to found a lot of the things he's saying on surer foundations. And it would also explain a more functional way of living within the world. When you live as someone who's defined by gratitude, you're not fixated upon your rights. But you have a way of relating to the good things that you have received in a way that's liberating and empowering. And exploring that, I think, would be wonderful within the framework of his thought. It would not detract from it. It would actually strengthen it.
Great. Well, thanks. Great conversation.